Hey there, Colin Marshall here, host of the Marketplace of Ideas, letting you know that if you have any response to the program, props, critiques, or anything in between, any and all feedback is welcome. Just send it on to colin@colinmarshallradio.com. This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, it's a conversation with electronic musician, sound artist, and explorer of the intersection of noise, dissonance, and melody, Tim Hecker. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Tim Hecker is an electronic musician, sound artist, and explorer of the intersection of noise, dissonance, and melody. His new album is called An Imaginary Country from Cranky Records. Tim, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Colin.
From what I've read from other interviews with you, you're often asked to provide the concepts behind your recordings or to talk about the narrative that sprawls across them or to do some conceptualization. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're kind of frustrated with doing that, right?
I like to think of myself as a musician that works purely on the plane of sonic experience. And often, I'm, forced or I decide to enter into a format, which is a CD, which requires visual and textual accompaniment. And I usually, have to abide by that. So, I use cover art. I make album titles. I have to name the record. And, the problem is that I don't really think of it in this overarching kind of conceptual apparatus in the same way that it's often taken in terms of how it's framed afterwards. So I named my last album An Imaginary Country, which is, something I read in reference to Debussy. But that idea wasn't something that was with me when I made the record and wasn't, a major factor in how I thought about the pieces assembling. But then afterwards, when it gets reviewed, it's like, this musician's taking you on a journey to another land. And it's kind of frustrating a little bit. But I mean, having said that, that's fine. But I don't think that those kinds of ways of framing the music are necessary, for me at least.
Does that make you, in the world of electronic music, kind of an outlier? Because it seems to be, from what I've read, from what you've said in interviews, you call it a bit of pseudo-conceptualization that goes on a lot in electronic. Does that make you significantly different?
I think that a lot of different musicians have responded to that problem I'm talking about in many different ways. So I have sympathies with, some experimental electronic musicians in the 90s, groups like, say, Autechre, who used randomly generated track titles. That kind of developed into its own cliche after a period of time. But on the other hand, there's people that go, totally in the other direction and, set up a really elaborate conceptual frame that to me seems sometimes dubious. I've sort of been in between the two. I mean, I see the act of naming a musical product as a kind of, an invitation to a poetic interlude and, a chance to kind of add a little bit to the narrative of the music. But at the same time, once you inscribe that narrative, it's bound to it. And it's kind of like there's a fusion that is impossible to remove it afterwards. So there's just an ambivalence about that. And there's nothing you can really do about it unless you do go the route of, intelligibility or, not naming something or using something that just can't be understood at all.
And so when you're reading these reviews that say, well, Tim Hecker's doing this and this and this and this, I'm sure of it, in his latest album, is it kind of cool that people are getting these strong responses or feeling these strong responses to your music? Or is it kind of irritating, maybe I wasn't thinking that necessarily, and here they're saying that I was?
Yeah, it's both, because on the one hand, I'm immensely happy that people actually care about what I do, that they've decided to, pick my CD out of a monstrous pile of millions to listen to it and pay attention to it and write about it. And then other people have actually read it. And I think I'm super grateful for that. But at the same time, sometimes, how it's discussed in terms of taking metaphors of, say, song titles literally as this kind of, this is a soundtrack which expresses the feeling of tundra or, the ocean is, there is no tundra or ocean in my mind when I'm making it, It's a studio work that I started from nothing or started from a kernel that, its relations are immanent. They're inside itself. It's a work that, doesn't it's not outside of reference. I would never claim that, but it's definitely not directly inspired by the tundra. So there's a little bit of frustration that comes from that. But these are, petty little quibbles. I mean, I'm lucky to be able to, make a small living off making music, and that's fantastic. So I would take this in a second.
At the end of the day, then it's just
Absolutely.
people can make up whatever they want about it. The bottom line is they're listening to you, and there's a lot of artists. I don't know. I mean, I know that genre labels are not something you really like, but in the genre you are usually lumped in, there's a million guys. Well, maybe not a million, but hundreds of thousands of guys all working and getting ignored.
Yeah, it's the hardest thing to do. Yeah, I'm quite happy because it is a tough and kind of abundant field of cultural production. And so I would have to say that in the end of the day, I would choose a review that's slightly off to my, petulant ways than not have a review at all. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Now, in this field that you work in, I don't, without using genre labels, I guess, what would you call it? What would you call the group that you get lumped into?
My musical kind of career or arc, if you want to call it that, really started with beat-driven music, into techno and a movement which is called IDM, and I slowly kind of let go of those. I quickly let go of rhythms quite sharply at about 2001, and I decided to work entirely in a textual field. That's been a kind of, like, as you said in the introduction, I've been working to kind of make a synthesis or some sort of work that, marries, I guess, noise, dissonance, and melodic kind of textures with that. You could say that it fits in a whole bunch of distinct genres, everything from electronic music, ambient. There's times when it's like black metal or death metal or something like that, and, all the way to new age. The fact that sometimes I've heard about my music being used in yoga soundtracks for yoga practice, and then, at the same time being discussed on a kind of black metal bulletin board is for me like a, fantastic kind of contradiction. And, that's what kind of keeps me going, that kind of insane synthesis or bifurcation of interests and people that are interested in the music.
To hear your surprise at how the current phase of your career is being received both on black metal message boards and in yoga classes, I do wonder what expectations, if any, did you have of who would receive your music best when you started doing what you're doing now?
I've tried to kind of keep that expectation of a type of audience outside of my thinking when I'm working on the music. I try to keep it internal and of interest to me only. Of course, that's an impossible limit experience. I don't think that you can do that entirely, but to be honest, I really have no idea, and that shifts all the time, and that's what's surprising and interesting about it for sure.
It's interesting hearing you talk about your work and listening to it as well. I mean, it seems to be an organic process that you describe when you talk about how you make music, how you put together sound, and then when you listen to it, there's, I don't want to get too vague here, but there is an organic feel to it as well. But I wonder what was the seed that began the organic process that was this new album, An Imaginary Country? Because you had to start out with something, not an overarching concept, not anything rigid, of course, but what was it that began it?
I generally, work on an album every year or two, and I go through a cycle where I kind of, after I'm done the last record, I just kind of let go of it and I don't turn on the studio for a few months. And I kind of think about where I'd like the music to go a bit more. I'm definitely not a musician that really ascribes to the idea of radical reconstitution or radical transformation as the high point of artistic creation. You know what I mean? Self reinvention. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. You prefer the idea of maybe iteration?
Yes, slow development. I think that a sort of almost craft approach to musical progression is a good thing also. And so I generally come at it with a broad idea of what I want to do, something a bit heavier, something lighter, something more melodic, something more dissonant. And it's as vague as a feeling, and I just start to work on it slowly. And it's, the album comes out as a kind of organic unity, and I very much, work on albums as a compositional unity in and of itself. There might be, 10, 15 tracks that are in that, but it's composed as one piece, even though, you could call them distinct songs. I really pay attention and spend a lot of time at the end of making a record as, weaving that fabric of the album as a coherent piece. That's why there's, very rarely like, the 2-second gap, which is, common to kind of song-based records. I have my records flow usually without stops, or they have jarring, starts and stops, but that's more compositionally, derived than, the CD format, dictating a 2-second pause or whatever. And so going back to the album construction, even though it seems like an organic piece, it's quite a long work of painfully fraught, revision and transformation and pummeling and reorganizing and shifting, and it's an immense amount of work to make that kind of like fluid organicness. But having said that, that's definitely, has been my goal up to this point for sure.
And speaking of the unified nature of your albums, and especially this new one, of course, I want to give listeners a taste of it, and I was really worrying to myself what tracks I was going to use, because it's, I don't want to cut the album apart. I can't play the whole album, obviously. I mean, that would be just distributing the thing. But so I had actually, the problem was solved when Brian at Cranky only cleared 2 specific tracks for me, so I was like, great, problem solved. So we'll hear the first one now. This is Sea of Pulses. That was Sea of Pulses from Tim Hecker's new album, An Imaginary Country. What elements are we hearing there? What were you working with sound-wise to build Sea of Pulses?
The irony with that piece was I was actually had the idea of like doing a revision of Steve Reichian Pulse work that, was more distorted and more overdriven and, almost more overbearing than, say, something like Music for 18 Musicians. But a lot of the tracks I've really liked in the end were a failure from the original idea. Like, it's nothing like that at all. It's almost like, a more throbbing bass line in a traditional pop rock sense or something like that. But that piece itself you could describe it as a kind of compendium of different layers, which are really anchored upon a bass line. And that bass line itself is like maybe 3 or 4 different tracks which morph into each other. And it's kind of, I guess you would say it's a sort of slow development into an almost neo-reverential song, because there's like distinct sort of organ or reedy tones to it that are obviously digitally processed and build up into it. But I would say that the basic kernel or idea of it comes from a sort of failed, idea, which was to kind of do an overdriven Reichian pulse work.
It's funny because you can call it a failed idea, but in another way, that's kind of how a lot of worthwhile creative efforts come together, is there's an idea that just gets evolved away from it, goes on a different branch of the evolutionary tree, right?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, that's probably, at the root, many fantastic discoveries or failed endeavors, I wouldn't say that I think the accident should be the primal, driving force of artistic creation. I'm not really there on that kind of line of argument, but I think that you have to be open to see opportunities that come out of things that don't work out as you might expect them to be.
How much of your work would you say that is part of the process, where you had an idea, but you could say you failed at that idea, but you really just jumped the tracks onto something that you thought worked even better?
Yeah, I would say that my whole life has been basically that to a certain extent. I mean, I've come at every sort of work with like a kind of, an inspiration that, let's fuse this like heavy metal distortion turbo rat guitar pedal with something really tranquil and serene and see what comes out of that. And that overarching, hunch was the driver that led to, something I couldn't have imagined. And maybe I'm different in that sense to other musicians. Like, I remember Michael Jackson being interviewed, or he was talking about how he created some of the songs for, I think, the Thriller album. And I think the idea I got out of it was that he had a dictaphone on his bedside table, and he would have these visions at night of song structures, and he would wake up and sing into the dictaphone, and then that would become the composition. It would be visions which would be transcribed into actual thought out or realized projects from, visions or dreams. And I'm kind of different, quite different in the sense that I don't have that vision, and I've never really achieved anything I've thought about or hoped for. But I've been open to, diversions and changes that are different.
You might say, though, that you both, if I'm going to draw parallels between you and Michael Jackson, you both have that's like a compositional seed sort of method, though, where he has something he's saying into a microphone at 2 a.m. from a dream, and you have an idea that you might want to pay tribute to something else. And I mean, both of those projects evolve. They must both evolve away from whatever was the original vision. I mean, it just sounds like he has more of an idea about
literally how the song would take shape and the words and utterances, where this was like a conceptual apparatus, which is, doesn't prescribe the musical content itself, if that makes sense.
Listening to Sea of Pulses, I get the feel that, well, because I've tried it, I've checked this out empirically, that it's a track that, like many of yours, you can turn it down low and it sounds one way, but when you turn it up high, it sounds very different. And I don't know if you know what I mean there. I'm not getting it across all that clearly, but is that a conscious thing, or is that something that just happens to be your sensibility when it comes out?
I've always kind of heeded like Brian Eno's maxim about ambient music being able to function on 2 levels, like an attentive listening and also something that can recede back and fill space, almost like wallpaper. or furniture. I think it was acoustic furniture was the reference. I'm not exactly sure. I don't remember, but
I think it was furniture.
yeah, that's right. And I've always felt that I've wanted it to function on those two levels as well, but I've always put emphasis onto the heavier side at full volume, and I wanted the emphasis more on how it would sound at maximum volume, as loud as possible. That's always been definitely an interest of mine for sure.
To go back to what we were saying about audiences earlier, it's kind of like you turn it down and it's yoga class, you turn it up and it's appealing to the black metal fanboys on the internet.
Yeah, almost. Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of the internet, I wanted to ask you, I believe this was something that had been on your MySpace page, but I wanted to make sure to bring it up. You mentioned one of your favorite artists, your artistic heroes, being the filmmaker Werner Herzog. And this is very much common ground because he's also one of my artistic heroes. What inspiration does he give you?
I guess you could sum it up in like the making of Fitzcarraldo or something. I mean, it's it's an idea of pure madness, but it's also like, something that comes out of that madness. I mean, I don't work like that myself, but I appreciate like his intensity that he brings to his works. And, I enjoy like on a purely aesthetic idea, some of his early, like not less narrative based sort of almost quasi-documentary projects like, Fata Morgana or Lessons of Darkness, things like that. I mean, they're fantastic pieces of cinema. And, I love his idea of, the spectacular, I think it's spectacular lie. What was his, or ecstatic truth.
Ecstatic truth, yes.
Which is like, sacrifices documentary truth, cinema verite or whatever. That should trump, documentary truth. And I think that's a fantastic idea I've always loved. And I think he's just, fantastic, like, crystal of intensity that, hope he carries on working forever.
Crystal of intensity is a good way to describe that. There's a parallel that just popped into my mind as well, that he too has this take it as it comes and use whatever fate happens to give you, incorporate it into your work kind of sensibility. When he was filming Aguirre, I believe, in the jungle flooded, so he said to himself, I'm not going to cancel the movie, we'll just have the jungle flood in the movie.
Yeah, for sure. There's certainly like, let's roll with what we have idea. I mean, I think sometimes people make too much of a meal out of his idea of like, the ecstatic truth, and then that becomes for them the idea that Herzog never tells any truth at all, and everything is a lie. And I totally disagree. Like, I'm one that feels something like Grizzly Man, is a real tale about probably that person existed. Was that, recording of him being eaten alive real or fake? I don't know. And I don't really care, but I'd prefer to think it was real, and be wrong.
Certainly we have no reason to doubt him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you ever had the equivalent in any of your, whether it's live or whether it's recorded, I do know the studio is your main forum, but your equivalent of the jungle flooding and you had to kind of work with a disaster?
Not really, unless you consider, hard drive failures, some equivalence to being in the jungle and having it flood. I don't think you can make the same comparison because it's really a kind of anemic equivalence, I suppose.
Well, hard drive failures are also very, very, very sucky. So
yeah,
it's no jungle.
It's more something like the void opening up in front of you than, a flood coming into your space.
One of the other artists you had there on your heroes list was, I believe, Goya. And what has Goya given you?
I don't know. I wrote those three influences in a flippant kind of 1 second blast of illumination. But I've always loved his they're the black paintings. I can't remember the exact name. And his etchings like Los Capriccios. I just get inspiration out of that. It's something I've always held close to my heart, I suppose. But I don't think that I'm trying to do music that shares anything in common with that at all.
It's kind of like someone's real artistic heroes are rarely going to be someone who works in their own form, though. It seems like the best use I see made of that sort of inspiration is someone who works in a completely different time, place, and medium, but the person says to themselves, well, what would what I do be like if I made it like what they did, Absolutely. Like, I think like someone like Gerhard Richter for me isn't it equivalent in the sense that some of my best work has come out of the idea of like what would be the sonic equivalent of this large canvas abstract squeegee painting, and you work on that idea for the morning and see what comes, and sometimes it's quite surprising and fantastic.
Sometimes I brought like art catalogs into my studio and I just sit there, and it's kind of cheesy and cliche. And when I hear someone talking about this, I roll my eyes a little bit. But, it's true for me, at least personally, and I've gotten good things out of that. But, I wouldn't say it's the major driver. But that kind of synesthesia, is a good thing sometimes.
Did you have any similar spurs to action when you were making the new album, An Imaginary Country? Were there any just things, and I intentionally am being that vague, things that made you try stuff out and do your sort of probing method of creativity?
I would say that the thing of that record was a pull back from immensity and a pull back from, going towards heaviness, which had been the kind of major push of like, the few records before that, where I was trying to make things more intense and more distorted and more kind of channeling intensity into a powerful, form on CD. This was like pulling back from the void a little bit, just working on a more maybe slightly simpler compositional structure and melodic, more sort of present melodic aspects to it. And also I'd say the bass lines, pulses and things like that were a lot more prevalent than before.
Had you found with the earlier albums you would hit a personal wall of immensity, or you just kind of wanted to take a breather from that with something different, a palate cleanser, we'll say?
No, I would just say that I had the idea of making, usually, the records before that, I would have the hope of making something heavier than what I actually made. I never achieved it, so I would keep kind of working more and more and pushing it a bit. I never really got to that idea of total heaviness, maybe because I thought that record would be overbearing. I'm not sure, but it's always just kind of pushing that threshold of what would be listenable. Sometimes I'd ask myself these records, like I wouldn't want to put it on in the morning, and something about me, still wants to make a record where, that's not ruled out, from the start.
How much of that do you think is cultural context? Like, do you think maybe 10 years down the line something heavier will be more acceptable, or do you think this is more of a human thing where it's like there's a limit to heaviness a human is going to want to hear?
I don't know. I would tend to be skeptical of like, essentializing what people would listen to. I really think that it's culturally conditioned for the most part. And I think that, heaviness or softness is not an innate, Darwinian imperative, but more of a culturally inscribed kind of aesthetic conditioning. So I would say probably not. And I think who knows what the future might hold. Maybe it will be a revolution in sonic intensity. Who the heck knows?
What sorts of elements are you proudest of on An Imaginary Country? Just looking at it from this perspective, what do you think what you really surprised yourself with, if anything, on this album?
I'm not exactly sure how I would condition it. One thing is that I don't really listen to my records after I'm done them. So say, for example, this one, I wrapped it up last summer. I've listened to it maybe once in about 8 months, 9 months. So it kind of fades from your mind after a while. Like I almost forget what I've made. And before I do an interview, sometimes I listen to it to refresh a little bit. But I tend to try to like cultivate a sort of ignorance about it. And the only time I really listen to it is when I do a live concert in which I'm like reworking material or doing, sort of variations on those pieces, or when I'm actually beginning a new record. So I kind of have some sort of positioning and recognition of where it's come from. And so I don't, like a lemming, remake the same old mistakes over again, or make the same album every 2 years, forgetting what I made, a year and a half before, or something like that.
Do you think that's a common affliction in the electronic world?
I think that for a musician that works on a studio project so intensely, for a short period of time, like all the time, going back and making subjective evaluations over your work, over what's good and what's not, that gets draining after a while. And there's a point where you can't handle listening to it anymore. And yeah, I know many people who just let it go. Once it leaves their hand and goes to the mastering plant, it's dead to them or something like that.
I certainly can't think of any reliable way to gain distance from your own work. I mean, as I'll do an analogy here. It's like I don't listen to the old interviews that I broadcast because, well, invariably, and tell me if you have the same deal, invariably all I'm going to be doing is kind of cringing at the technical ways that I've improved. I don't know. Is that something you would be doing?
Of course, like, absolutely. I do, sometimes I've been sitting around my house, and I have the state broadcaster from Canada, CBC, playing, and this piece comes on, and I'm like, oh, geez, that's a good, that's an interesting piece. That seems familiar. Then I'm like, what is that? And then, I find out that was my own work. And it's kind of this strange deja vu or something where it's like, ooh, I don't really, recall that. And it's, it's a sort of amnesia, I suppose, but it's kind of uncanny, but, it's good. I think it's good to let go of that a little bit.
It's like seeing a friend you haven't seen in 20 years, and how much they've changed since they were 17 or something, and you think, wow, I'm disturbed that I didn't recognize you earlier.
Yeah, there's a kind of paralyzing, shock that comes with dealing with the past, looking at old photo albums. It's fantastic, but it's also this kind of, I don't know, there's a kind of stunnedness that comes from that also. And yeah, there's definitely a musical equivalent. I don't know many, musicians, artists, whatever, that, are fully cognizant of their entire bibliographic production over the years at any given moment. There's a kind of, I find a lot of people cultivate that kind of amnesia.
Have you ever found yourself able to consciously reference your own past, or is that something you kind of wouldn't consider very often?
Reference in what way?
Well, I suppose I intentionally leave that open because some musicians, especially in the electronic arena, will actually sonically reference their older stuff in their newer stuff.
In terms of sampling or what?
Yeah, that's the thing, see, because I could mean this in any number of ways.
Yeah.
But I guess a better way to phrase this would be, how much, if any, inspiration do you ever get from your older stuff when you're making something newer? Or is it always a new book rather than a new chapter, if you know what I mean? Because you're not into revolution, as you said, but... Yeah. There must be, what's the connection, I guess? What's the through line?
I would say that it's probably both, like a kind of, inward look and an outward look. I mean, I just spent like a couple minutes telling you that I don't try to focus on making music that has external references like tundra or, oceanic experience or, seafarers, melancholy or whatever. But at the same time, I do get I suppose inspiration and sort of index my own, decisions about how to proceed with my own work in different ways that come both from the world and from, my own dissatisfaction or happiness with what I've done in the past. So I would probably say it's a mix of the two.
If you're just tuning in, it's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. At our website, colinmarshallradio.com, you will find our complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive, as well as other podcasts and more fun stuff. My guest is electronic musician and sound artist Tim Hecker. Now, I want to make sure that we hear a couple tracks rather than just one from the new album. So here is the other track cleared by the good people at Cranky, Paragon Point. That was Paragon Point from Tim Hacker's new album, An Imaginary Country. With that track, what was the seed there? If you can remember, I mean, I'm not asking for anything super solid, but what was kind of the impetus?
That track was, sort of started off with the hope of doing a very slow moving, kind of more layered, slightly more distorted, overdriven, Robert Fripp-esque inspired kind of guitar piece. I mean, it comes from EBow and guitar at its very core, but what it ends up being is about 20 layers of EBow that kind of bounce and ping off each other in a kind of chord structure. I would say that came from a basic idea of Fripp style EBow doing 8-second delay lines that cascade over each other.
Now, for someone who's listening who has not done much composition themselves, I kind of want to give them an idea of the process here that you just glossed, which is like
absolutely
putting layer upon layer. I guess what we should get is a little clearer technical idea of how you actually stack things up.
Okay, so you can imagine a song that you can hear, a more simple idea, because I work in sort of abstract compositional references. A pop song has, a bunch of different instruments that are played, and those are recorded as layers. For example, drums are on one track, bass is on another, and guitar vocals on another track, and those are mixed down. I do something similar where I take probably 5, 10, 15, or 20 different tracks of pieces that I've all worked on my own, developing and pounding and reformatting that till the reference often I like to work becomes vague, that instrument plays with its natural intelligibility as a clear, resonant stringed object, and something that always plays with that unknowing of what it is. And I usually build up pieces that are, densely composed in terms of those layers, and I mix that down into one final track that then becomes the song, if that makes sense. Is that a good description of musical composition?
I think that is, but we should also talk about the way that you got to this method. Now, I want to talk a little bit about your journey. What you often reference in interviews is that because you're asked directly, I suppose, is your own childhood and adolescence in what you've called a suburban musical setting. Now, what does that mean you were exposed to?
I think that was just a kind of quip that, I didn't grow up, studying conservatory music or, the music of Xenakis or Stockhausen. I kind of grew up in a more vernacular environment, and this music came to me through, roundabout ways. And it was very much a kind of, not do it yourself, but sort of it was to a certain extent. I mean, I was working with computer music at the point where it was just becoming like a really easy available tool in and of itself. Getting software that was, free or very cheap on the internet, building computers myself from, low cost parts. They're called OEM, where you stick, build the computer from, video card and motherboards and, build it like some guy in his garage builds up his hot rod or whatever. That was at the same time where I was, my work started in a more kind of traditional instrumentation perspective. I was working, in bands and hoping to, make, musical groups, where I'd play guitar or drums. How I came to working solo and doing all this myself was at the failure of those group projects, for whatever reason, they just didn't congeal into any project, And so I bought a sampler and I began to sample those other instruments to just accompany myself or with other people as we lost people. And after a while, I used that sampler with a computer and started just really constructing pieces based on sampled material. And increasingly, the work went inside the computer. It became a full-fledged electronic music kind of project. I've since gone back out into, hardware and tactile and things like that, but it's still very much, a solo project, and it's very much, digitally computer driven.
Were you first exposed to, or did you first encounter music that we would call electronic, or was it first like the avant-garde that you encountered and kind of broadened your interest? I suppose which just came into your life earlier?
I would say like more conventional, accessible electronic music was my route in. It wasn't through the more difficult, mind-bending works of GRM school or diese Darmstadt. Yeah, I mean, definitely not. It came through, 1990s era artists like Aphex Twin and Autechre and Brian Eno coming before him. Things like that is what led me into doing what I do now. And, I've always kept an open ear, and I've slowly, learned and sort of probed out deeper than that, obviously. But those were the original seeds.
Was the idea that music is something that can be taken beyond the rhythmic and beyond what a lot of people conventionally understand as music, was that an idea you had to learn, or did you kind of have the open-mindedness to begin with? Sometimes musicians have to get that idea put into them before they really go exploring sound-wise. But was this an attitude you had for a long time, or?
Yeah, I think it was a slow, like, kind of dawning that I could do more things than just sample guitar, for example, and drums, and construct a rock piece through sampled instrumentation. I slowly put those drums into granular synthesis and turned it into, a cloud of scattered percussions, and I took the bass line and put that through a 20-second reverb into this giant cavernous wash. And those things slowly kind of developed, and that, the possibilities of sound became more obvious as I worked more in the medium. It wasn't something where I was inherently, instantly open to the infinitude of sonic transformation at all. Definitely not.
You have been going on this musical journey, or rather for much of it seems like. You were going on it while you also had a parallel career, which sounded like a fairly good one, actually, in provincial government, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
How did you juggle that when you were coming up? Because it sounds like, you had a real career. You weren't driving a pallet jack or serving drinks like a lot of musicians do.
Yeah, I don't know, that all that stuff kind of happened by accident, and I wasn't looking to get a career. It just kind of fell upon me because I had I was studying at the time and the job was open. But yeah, I think that for me personally, having, another means of income, like a lot of people, it takes the pressure off needing to, that be their only source of bread and butter. But most of my colleagues, work primarily as musicians, and I totally respect that. But I found that I've been just as productive as when I've had, really tight time constraints than when I've had all the time in the world being a, full-time musician or whatever. I often get more done when, I have 3 hours, in the early evening, or, 2 hours in the morning. I can kind of focus and work as effectively as if I have 16 hours to just kind of mess around each day. Somehow that's worked for me, and, it's the way I'm still doing it to this day.
And could you tell us a bit about the experience of eventually leaving behind what I believe you called the golden handcuffs, or maybe the interviewer did in another interview, of getting a pension on all the benefits and all that, to become a PhD student as well as always, a musician?
I decided to do that partly just because I've always enjoyed reading and writing and thinking, and I found that my brain was, despite working as a musician, my brain in terms of ideas was dulling a little bit with time, and I just wanted to go back and spend a few years reading and writing and doing my music as well. And that's what I'm still doing to this day. And, it's quite a happy balance right now. I enjoy, the mix of things, and it definitely works for me.
And what are you studying for the PhD?
I'm right now working in a field called communication studies, and basically I'm doing a thesis on a history of loud sound between the late 19th century and early 20th century, looking at loudness in a way that's different from traditional studies on noise as a kind of annoyance. I'm looking at it as a generative, sort of productive aspect. It's essentially historical theoretical work.
Are we talking about loud sound in any context possible, or more toward, your career is music, so obviously you're thinking a little bit about loud sound as it relates to music?
Absolutely. For example, I'm doing a chapter which focuses on monster pipe organs at the turn of the century, particularly the work of an English-born manufacturer named Robert Hope Jones, who, led the push within pipe organs to a movement called high wind pressure. And high wind pressure was forcing more wind through the pipes to make them louder and more powerful. At the same time, organ builders were working on making larger and larger instruments. At the apex in Atlantic City, they built an organ which had 35,000 pipes, and it filled a giant convention center. It's the largest instrument ever built, and it's just a fantastically insane idea. And like, go back to something like Herzog. I mean, I find so many parallels with the kind of Fitzcarraldo dream of the opera in rural Latin America as, building one of these insane monster organs. Yeah, that's how I spend my time right now, aside from music. It
just occurred to me that with the history of loud sound, depending on how far back you're going to find a wealth of fascinating information, because we don't think about it, those of us who don't have this PhD, we don't think about how sound was loud before there was, amplification and electricity and stuff. There must be a lot to learn from eras where things were generally quieter, I would imagine, because we didn't have all the ways to get louder.
I mean, there's a few issues related to that I haven't really made my mind up on. Like, one is the assumption that the cities and human environments are always getting louder. Like, I'm not entirely convinced that has historically has been just a straight upward arc. Sometimes I feel that maybe in the 20s or 30s there was an apex of loudness and things went down with, say, for example, sound insulation technologies, insulating your walls with the idea that can actually, absorb the noise of the neighbors, or, office spaces that would put, acoustic tilings that would absorb the noise of the typewriters. With every technological, advancement in noise generation, for example, the Industrial Revolution, there's also technologies which, abate that noise. So it's a kind of double helix, I suppose.
And we're running out of time, or at least we're low on it. And we're running low, but I want to make sure to ask this as well. How much feedback do you see between your dual careers now that you're a communication theory student and a musician? Do you see much talk between these two halves of your life?
Not distinctly. Like, I don't think of them as a unity, but I think of them as complementary things I do that, make my life whole. And there's some sort of logic to it, but it's not a direct one. It's kind of, I do two things that are definitely linked, but they're not, bound together at all.
Do you know yet? I know this is bound to change when you're actually doing it, but for the next musical project, do you know whether, at least initially, you're going to go on a upward toward the louder or downward toward the quieter path?
That's a good question. I think that sometimes the day changes, my mood changes, but I feel lately that's just going to, hopefully I will succeed in making an overbearingly loud and intense record, but I'm not sure, but I'll definitely begin working on that in the next few months.
Well, I certainly look forward to seeing whatever boundaries you do push. The new album, once again, is An Imaginary Country. Tim Hacker, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the program.
Thanks, Colin. It's a pleasure.
Tim Hacker's own website is sunblind.net. This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. Our theme music is produced by Ben Althouse. Hear more of his work at benalthouse.com. For more information on the Marketplace of Ideas, or for our complete interview archive, visit colinmarshallradio.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.